obviously, thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk a little bit about your journey within defence. Dealing with individuals within defence and also central government as well. That'd be really interesting to hear about. But maybe it would be great if you could introduce yourself in your own words, really.
Okay, sure. So I'm Mivy James. I'm Head of Consulting and Director for Digital Transformation at BAE Systems. And so what that means is I these days advise big government change programs and help them out, but I'm also responsible for managing the work of some of our consultants as well inside the business. Shall I give you a bit of a potted history of my career path as to how I got to where I am?
That was going to be my next question. I was going to ask.
Okay.
Where you are today.
Great. So many years ago, more years than I care to admit to, I did a computer science and maths degree. So that was at the University of Manchester. So that was about 25 years ago. And got a graduate job, having had a few jobs during the long summer holidays when at university as a coder. For various engineering firms, and so got a job as part of a graduate program, and went straight into working in the defence space. So the first few projects I did were quite small, kind of operational research type projects, so sort of quite a lot of maths involved in them, and fairly small teams. And then kind of over the years, I sort of evolved to being a software team leader, did quite a lot of system design. I worked on traffic control systems, and then moved into banking and insurance. So I worked as a lead developer, and then mainly did the architecture for those systems and a bit of project management, which I decided was not for me. Went back into more technical stuff. And then kind of concluded that whilst it has its frustrations sometimes about some of the sort of the pace of change, I missed working in the government sector. I found that very, very rewarding and kind of interesting. And there's something about doing things for the greater good, the noble cause or something. So I went sought out a job which would lead me back into that kind of space, which is how I ended up at what's now my part of BAE Systems. That was 15 years ago, and did architecture for a few different government projects, including things like the Met Police and secure system design. And now I work across a few government departments, including in the defence sector. So I've got quite a lot of variety, really, which I think is quite interesting. But I do spend quite a lot of time working with the Ministry of Defence and various elements as well.
Yeah, awesome. You already mentioned that your day's got a lot of variety in it, but do you have a typical day? Can you describe what a normal Tuesday looks like for Mivy James?
Yeah. Well, these days there's quite a lot of consistency because I hardly ever leave my home office, although I am trying to get out and about a bit more. Who knew that we would ever miss our commutes and our kind of train journeys and things like that? Yeah. So I've got a mix of internal and external facing responsibilities. So the kind of a typical day for me would involve a mix of those. So today might be quite a good example where I actually started my day at 7 o'clock this morning, which is kind of unusual. But I was involved in a conference aimed at the sort of international government audience. So that was for based in Singapore, talking about digital transformation. Luckily, I pre-recorded my speech, so I didn't have to have all my wits about me at 7 this morning. But then there was a Q&A section. And then throughout the day, I've done a mix of internal and external facing stuff, some thought leadership, to go on some of our website, and but also managing staff internally. So a few times a year I check in with people and help them with their career development, and also some of our business strategy as well. So it's a kind of a real mixed bag. Sometimes I may run workshops with clients, and sometimes I might be embedded in project teams with clients. all the stuff I've done recently has been around digital transformation and journey to agile for government departments. So working with chief technology officer and enterprise architecture type functions in those government departments.
And I mean, obviously, you do a lot of work like in the defence sector. Would you say there's much difference between specific defence departments as opposed to government departments?
Apart from the uniforms, not really. I think everyone's dealing with the same set of problems, and the digital transformation is something that we hear everyone talk about. Doing things faster, keeping up with technology cycles, dealing with how to manage legacy systems in a cost-effective way whilst also bringing on board new technologies, and those kind of things are quite universal. And I think the sort of the thing that's, I guess, different in defence that you don't get elsewhere is the sheer range of platforms that you've got to contend with. So most government departments, the IT systems are, in fixed locations. You might be connecting to them remotely, but they're you can think of them as sort of like any other business in terms of offices. The kind of the added complexity for defence is stuff might be moving around on a ship or in a plane or something that needs to be deployed somewhere else. And then there's much more variety of tech from the things that we might be familiar with in office environments, and sort of very proprietary tech, ruggedized things that are unique to the defence space, and all of it needs to connect up. So it's everything that you normally deal with, plus a whole load of additional complexity and things moving around, and maybe not having a good network connection to get the data back because of where it's deployed and what have you.
Yeah. Have you spent much time pre-virus, of course, on military bases on site? And have you been around the military much?
So the kind of bits that I deal with tend to be, whilst they might be on MOD sites, more to do with offices rather than the military bases. I mean, I've been to a couple of them, but most of the kind of tech strategy stuff tends to come from the more headquarters type environments.
Okay.
So it's it's similar to going to other government departments, really. Apart from more people being dressed the same.
Yeah, no, it's the common theme, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you find the I guess being like a woman in such a male-dominated arena, not necessarily in the consulting part, but when you're in defence, does it feel like there are is there like a clear divide that there's not many women around in defence?
So I'd say it's probably not that different to working in the tech industry as a whole, really. It's like I said, many years ago I did a computer science degree, and there weren't many girls who chose that as a subject.
Yeah.
And in the tech industry as a whole, it's not unusual to be in a team of design authorities or architects and to be the only woman on that team, particularly if it's a sort of fairly small team. So I don't think that the defence sectors, it's not a shock when compared to that. I think what's worth noting about the defence sector is the how many advocates there are for creating a diverse and inclusive culture, the kind of messages that have come out from the top, and the fact that it seems to be embedded in leadership culture that the importance of creating an inclusive environment. So I think, in the past there have been some sort of headlines, negative headlines perhaps, about what it's like to be in defence. But it's, I've never felt that I've been treated with anything other than kind of professional respect when I've worked in the defence sector.
That's interesting. I mean, you sort of covered my next question, really. I was going to say, do you think there are any diversity issues in defence? Because you're right, you do hear things, not so much recently, but in the last few years, of things coming out about there being issues, but it doesn't seem like you have been affected by them. Do you think there's anything like in the wider picture that's not being covered?
So I think there's an obvious lack of diversity in that, particularly at the sort of the more senior grades and things, it's sort of but that's not to say that it's not an inclusive culture.
Sure.
And I think there's, having spoken to sort of, people who work in that space, and also I think looking at their gender pay gap. I mean, there's a lot more to it than the gender pay gap, but actually there's very little gender pay gap in the British military, in the armed forces. That's available for anybody to have a look at, and it tells you what the gender split is. I know there's a lot more to diversity than gender, but this is the kind of the stuff that we can easily get the information on. And I think it's something like 10% of the armed forces are female, but there's less than a 1% gender pay gap. So they must be retaining and developing female talent at the same rates that they're developing and retaining male talent, which speaks volumes. You don't see that in other industries. You get a much better gender balance in the more junior grades, and then it kind of fades off as you go through into the more senior and influential positions.
Sure. I mean, that probably is one of the biggest misconceptions, I guess. I mean, it was going to be my next question, was what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions? I guess that would definitely be one of them. I imagine people would be quite surprised to hear that the gender pay gap is the smallest it is in the military. I imagine most people would think it would be probably one of the largest. So
yeah.
Are there any other misconceptions you think about there are about working in defence, specifically as a woman?
I think that's probably one of them. I think there's a sort of, it'd be easy as an outsider to think it's a really macho culture, and there's a lot of sort of negative connotations that might go with that, like thinking that because of that there's some toxic masculinity. But as somebody who works in the parts of it that I do, I've never seen that. I can't comment on what it is to be like a female soldier on the front line. But it's the other thing that I've noticed is there are plenty of advocates for inclusivity, and they're not D&I professionals. They're not people from underrepresented groups, which is what happens so often. That for example, in the tech industry, because there's such a gender gap, it often falls almost entirely on the shoulders of women to try and address that. But it's you just need to look at the sort of social media profiles of almost some of the people out there, and they will declarely state themselves to be he for she or something like that, which is really nice to see, just as part of their normal day jobs. It's not because they sponsor their exec sponsor for a particular employee resource group. And I think that just kind of normalizes the importance of it, which is something that I think other industries could maybe learn from a bit.
Yeah. Do you think it's easier now to get to be in defence, even the more niche area of yourself, like technology defence, than it was or has been previously? Do you think it's getting easier to get into it?
So I think defence is less closed than it used to be. There's sort of rather than thinking they do stuff which is completely unique, they're making use of more commercially available technology. So I think the sort of the routes in are, perhaps there are more routes in than there used to be. You don't have to necessarily go and work for a major defence supplier to work in the defence space. If you're in the tech sector, you could work in almost like any type of technology organisation, any tech startup, and find yourself doing some things that are of relevance to defence, because I think they've just cast that net a lot wider.
Yeah. No, that is interesting. I think when it comes to just the general kind of what's the word for it? Just the attitudes of everyone, I think is getting better. And I think one of my aims for this series is more around I guess having role models like yourself, as opposed to maybe pushing people in something which they may not be interested in, but if they can hopefully watch maybe this interview and others we're going to do in the future and see what it's actually like, then I think that the role model approach is better than maybe the quota approach that you see sometimes. I mean, what do you think on that? Because have you seen much of that? We must hire X of this demographic and this much of the demographic. Have you seen much of that?
I think a lot of these kind of things I describe as being a bit of a paradox, in that I think you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. So sure. if you set up quotas, then it can build resentment. And it doesn't matter how great a candidate is, if they either feel that they're there to meet a quota, or somebody makes that kind of passing comment, then it will erode their confidence. But then even when you don't have quotas, you hear that sometimes. You can hear somebody sort of say, well, you're just here to fill a quota, even if there's not been a declared quota. But at the same time, I think it's important where there are big gaps in diversity to take action to disrupt the status quo, because without action, we'll just end up never driving that change. And I think we can all agree that change isn't really going fast enough. So some ways around it that I've seen, which I think are quite good, are quotas for applicants. So, encouraging recruiters to put forward a more diverse set of candidates. It doesn't mean that you've got quotas for hiring, but it's just mixing up the pools that you're recruiting from. And it's, just because somebody doesn't already work in a sector, it doesn't mean that they don't have a talent that's interesting to that sector. Sort of one of the things that we often hear in the tech industry is, there aren't many women in leadership because of the pipeline. There aren't many women in the tech leadership because there aren't many women who go and do computer science degrees. But actually, I would, I don't know the stats behind it, but I'm as much a rarity for being a computer science graduate at my level of seniority as I am for being a woman. There are plenty of people who haven't come through that route, who came through a convoluted route into a role and kind of fell into tech almost by accident. So I don't buy that as an excuse. So I think it's good to almost force people to look at candidates differently. But then if you're not having the recruitment targets, then it kind of overcomes some of the stuff that might build that resentment that we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, no. Do you think let's use the new world buzzword, but like the way of working that we have these days, is a lot more remote. Do you think that will have an effect on the applicants you get come to roles, and even people changing across? Do you think that will have much of an effect?
So I think there's a bit of swings and roundabouts with it. So with remote working, there are some obvious benefits with it, but I think we're certainly not quite there with having proper flex working because of remote working. I don't know what your day is like, but I find that I sort of start my morning the same way I would do as if I was in an office, and I literally don't leave the chair that I'm sat in now until I right, that's it, I'm logging off. And I have to kind of almost make myself go out I went for a run at lunchtime today. I made myself get out of the house and get some daylight. So, if you're really doing sort of remote working properly, in theory, people could be in a different time zone. They could choose their own working pattern. It's a sort of being locked into phone calls and WebEx sessions and goodness knows what else is dictating people's working patterns. So unless remote working goes hand in hand with flexible working, it doesn't automatically lead to facilitating greater diversity. And I think there's some kind of other things that need to be kind of addressed, and we're not there with it yet, in that if people are remote, are you really getting visibility of who's doing what? There was a kind of a flurry of activity at the start of lockdown with looking at productivity, but I think it's there's almost a danger that more assertive people, or people who are so inclined, could take credit for the work of others, and more introvert people become hidden. For example, their contribution becomes more hidden because they're reluctant to kind of go, put their hands up and go, hey, like I did this thing. Whereas it's perhaps if they're in the same office as you, then you get more visibility of it. So I think that's something to watch out for as well with more remote working, that you're not always just paying attention to the loudest people, who are the ones who are kind of putting the meetings in your diary or sending you the emails or whatever it is. They're the people who are sort of it's less natural for them to come forward and put their hands up for thing or put their names to stuff, might end up kind of being sort of hidden both kind of physically and from the contribution, if that makes sense.
No, totally. I know what you mean. I know we've spoken about before about the book, team within teams. Do you think the military or defence, just in general, could be the industry to push forward? Because in theory, they should be really autonomous. I mean, decentralised command is a really old thing in the military. That's not far off 100 years old. Do you think they could spearhead that? We trust you. You crack on with your role, and we'll see the results at the end.
Yeah, I think it's to kind of an outsider like me, I think it's really interesting because the from what I understand, the sort of the way they operate when they're sort of in sort of operational mode compared to sort of being more in office space, there seems to be it seems to be quite different. In that when they're in warfighting mode, it's sort of everybody's kind of very clear on their role, who's empowered to do what, and there's a sort of there's a lot of thick parallels there I can see with some of the agile stuff that we look at when we're working in tech, and then there's sort of back in office space, it's easy to slip into something which is much more bureaucratic and hierarchical. And so maybe taking some of that sort of empowerment and agility back into the office space will kind of make that culture more ubiquitous without it becoming uncontrolled. And again, I think there's quite a lot of lessons learned with the shift to remote working. We all had to adapt our ways of working. We didn't wait for some senior person to tell us exactly what to do. Every team had to figure out for themselves how that was going to work. So that's it's and I know that the militaries had to go through exactly the same thing themselves. Just because they're military doesn't mean they're immune from COVID-19, and they've all had to sort of adapt to socially distanced ways of working. Sort of when back at base and so on. So I think that I think it's kind of got all the ingredients there. It's just like cultural change. It takes so long to drive, and people. I see this everywhere. That across all organisations that I've worked with, that people say the right things, and then kind of almost revert to type because that's what we're so familiar with. So we're very familiar with the ways of reporting progress and making decisions and who makes the decisions and how all of that works, which it's sort of I hope it doesn't take another generation to change that. But some of these ideas, like you said, aren't new. As I often refer back to How to Win Friends and Influence People, which was written in the 1930s, and it still rings true today. It's a sort of it was written by one of the most successful entrepreneurs in that era in the States, and it's all about treating people with respect, regardless of where they are in a hierarchy. And not being kind of the sort of the disingenuous things of treating people differently because of because they're more senior or whatever, and taking as much interest in everybody around you, and all of those things I think are just as true today. It's sort of when I reflect on that, I'm kind of like, well, why has that not become the standard way of working? What is it that's not quite right about I don't know, like whether it's society or our corporate environments or government departments or whatever, that means that's not a thing that we no longer need to reference back to.
And how do you find it when when you go in to do some consulting, you're speaking to like senior figures, if they've got that military background, do they see the parallels when you talk about agile ways of working? Do they connect the dots with potentially what they did when they were serving on tours straight away? Do they think, oh, that sounds familiar, the autonomous work, that sort of thing? Do they make those connections?
So yes, they do. They absolutely make those connections. I mean, I recognise that the ones that I interact with are probably the ones who have appetite for that kind of thing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be wanting to speak to me. So it's not necessarily indicative of the organisation as a whole. But so all of those things do seem to resonate. And there's definitely definitely a sort of a desire to shift towards normalizing that as much as can be appropriate.
Where do you think the the slowdown happens then? I mean, if we're talking, within defence specifically, if they do it on the battlefield, if you're talking about it, where's the issue? Where do you think things happen? We know culture takes time, but what's the issue most?
I mean, this is just my view, and it's kind of, I guess, it's part of my personality, because I'm not a fan of these kind of things. But I think it's sort of process and bureaucracy get in the way. And having to seek permission to do things. It's that there's so much of that that's sort of written down, and I think there's a tendency to we need to do something new, so let's write another standard, let's write another process, and it becomes so convoluted. It's impossible for anybody to actually be able to follow all of those things, as that kind of pours treacle over everything. I think what we probably need to do is not just in the defence sector, but almost like cull a lot of those things. So it might seem like an odd analogy, but something that we did in my part of the company a few years ago was change our dress code. So over time, like, dress codes become more and more complicated, and it'll be, somebody wore something that somebody else didn't like, I don't know, for the sake of argument, like flip-flops. So then it's like, well, don't wear this and don't wear that and don't wear flip-flops. So a new rule gets added all the time, as fashions change, and we just thought that's, it's unmanageable, it's unwieldy. Just dress appropriately. You're a grown-up, we hired you, we trust you to behave like a grown-up, so dress appropriately. And it's and that's kind of, whilst that might be subjective, it's just creates some trust, or demonstrates trust in people to behave like adults. And I think there's I sort of do wonder if there's almost like too many standards and processes. So if you try to do the right thing and follow procedure, it just slows everything down, and there are bottlenecks because there's somebody that's meant to provide permission for something, and then they've got a whole load of other stuff to do, and so navigating all of that can just make it really overly complex.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Do you think that the best way to start any sort of change, are you someone who starts with trust and allows people to do things their own way, and then if they maybe don't do the things that you'd like them to do, then you add in the layers, or do you add the layers first and trust it? How do you like to start things off?
I'd like to start with the trust element, and really trusting people, and it's as a leader, it's it's sort of your responsibility to put your teams together, to hire people, to promote people, and if you can't trust them, then you're kind of doing something wrong with those steps, so you're still accountable for what they're doing. So if you're not getting that right, you need to kind of go, well, what's wrong with the way that we're mentoring people, the way we're measuring performance, the way we reward people and promote them, and all of those kind of things. If there's kind of like a widespread evidence for behaviours that means that you kind of think, well, we can't trust these people to do this particular thing, we've got to enforce a whole load of rules. So I think it's the sort of leaders need to hold a mirror up to themselves and look at that a little bit differently, rather than kind of imposing a lot more rules on people, because there's enough rules and policy and legislation and stuff like that for people to adhere to anyway. Creating the right environment and conditions for people to have more autonomy, but to know where to go if they need help, rather than feeling like they're having to seek permission.
Yeah, okay. Have you ever seen the autonomy go too far? Have you got any kind of advice for anyone listening, where the cutoff point is between having that mentorship and guidance and being too far removed from it, that you are out of the loop?
I think it's I hope that as a leader, people feel comfortable bringing things to me, not to ask permission, but if they want to just bounce an idea off somebody, just to test it, and to sort of get feedback, rather than kind of a formal escalation or request for permission. So if they're sort of want to have that check in place, then they can do that. rather than sort of thinking, oh well, you know, I've got nowhere to take this, I've got no one to check it with, and either sort of going rogue, or not doing it at all. But I find it's more, I have to encourage people to drive change, and you know, to sort of go, well, you know, you've got this, or at least take it to the next step, and then we can sort of look at it again, rather than wanting to put the brakes on and kind of wishing somebody would come to ask me before they've done something.
I mean, I guess some people listening, you know, given that we're talking about, you know, digital transformation currently, we haven't really talked about technology, you know, at all. So it's, you know, maybe a bit of misconception that people think digital transformation is purely about technology. Are there any other misconceptions you think people have when it comes to, I know it's such a massive term, but, you know,
Yeah,
transformation?
I think it's I think there's a sort of a couple of traps that's easy to fall into. One is wanting to do it just because you're worried that you're falling behind everyone else. So kind of sort of recognizing some of the cultural aspects and that how they provide value to the organization rather than just playing catch up. And I think also it's a bit counterintuitive to sort of want to go and like, right, tomorrow we're going to suddenly have these new ways of working. Tomorrow we're all going to be agile or whatever it is. I think that's completely counterintuitive. I think, you know, moving towards it incrementally, choosing the bits which are either most urgent or perhaps some low-hanging fruit for that organization, and kind of going, well, how, you know, how's this working out for us? What do we like? What we don't like? What adjustments we need to make before moving to the next step. And kind of, you know, bringing people on that journey, rather than kind of going, you know, as of whatever it is, the 1st of March, we're all going to have this new way of working. Everybody's got to go on this training course or get this certification or whatever it is, because that's when you get almost a bit of an immune system response, and people start looking for reasons not to like the change. And so I think, you know, doing it incrementally and collaboratively is key. And I talk quite a lot about being self-evident with digital transformation, and for me that is self-evident. You know, having that collaborative culture and learning as you go is kind of part of what it's all about.
Yeah. How, I know, like in some organizations, you know, certainly some of the people I work with, they're trying to really push that no blame culture, so you can fail, and you're allowed to fail. How do you sort of, like, you know, organizations where there's, you know, like a fear of failure, or people are worried they're going to get it out, like, how do you get past that?
So I think there's a universal fear of failure. I think that it's or a reluctance to admit to failure, and I'm not sure. You know, people talk about no blame culture, but I still think people need to kind of you need to be accountable for the decisions. You know, as a leader, you need to be accountable, and if you're but with sort of failure, I talk about conscious decision making. Choosing to stop something is a good thing to do. And what often happens is initiatives start and then they just kind of lose momentum and they kind of fade or fizzle out, or resources get allocated elsewhere. But there's often a reluctance to kind of go, that's not working for us, we're going to stop doing it. We're going to consciously choose to stop doing that and choose to do something different. And I don't think that happens often enough. It just kind of withers. And I think what's then difficult is those people who've invested in it struggle to let it go and struggle to invest their efforts elsewhere. And I think it's, and people get this kind of initiative fatigue. And then, you know, it's a sort of like when strategies change, you know, new strategy gets published. You think, well, what happened to the last strategy? Have we completed it? Was it not right? What's different about this one? And I think having more transparency of, well, you know, these bits were working, these bits weren't working, this is a change in direction and here's why, will get more people bought into that strategy, rather than kind of going, well, that's the thing that the strategy team do, it doesn't affect us, which defeats the object of having it, you know. So you know, but that comes back to that fear of failure. It's hard, you know, it's very difficult for a lot of people, for most people, to kind of go, that wasn't working, so we're going to stop and we're going to try something different. be it whatever the initiative is, or investment in technology, or some technical innovation or whatever, to pulling the plug on something is really hard to do. But I think it takes a lot of courage. But I think that's something that we need to see more of.
Yeah, I mean,
so I think I've lost your. I don't know if you've gone on mute there. I've lost your sound.
at what point do you, when do you consider failure to have actually happened? How long do you give it? Before I guess you don't want to fail too quickly, but then you don't want to keep flogging the dead horse. So do you have a set, almost like a set rule where like, I think this is probably a point where this doesn't work and we can move on to the next?
I think it's, if you sort of set out on doing something, you need to kind of understand what the indicators for success are. So what kind of things we're trying to achieve with this, and how do we know what the early signs are of it working or not working? And that might be varied depending on the thing that you're doing. Is it getting traction? Are we putting a lot of, how long are we going to give it? Because you're right, because you can have these knee-jerk reactions to stuff and go, well, we started doing this thing, it's not got traction, so we're just going to stop and try something different. And if you're, coming back to the strategy example, sometimes you need to give time to roll stuff out. But I also think it's knowing how to bring that change on board. Something I see sometimes is people develop some thinking, it gets written up, it gets published, and then you think that's done. Why is it working? But that's almost the start of it. It's not the end of it. Declaring a new policy or publishing an idea or some thought leadership or whatever it is. It's almost it's pretty much the start of getting people on board with it, and the start of the rollout, rather than the point at which you decide that you're done.
Yes, that's super interesting. I think we've already covered some of the things that I guess would be your key messages when it comes to like digital transformation. I guess one of the key ones is like trusting first. But are there any other things that you think, don't want to be like a top three? That's such a too simplified a version. But is there anything that you think if anyone was listening to this and they were like, we don't even know where to begin, outside of trusting first, have you got any tips for people about where to start?
So think about what the headline goals that you're trying to achieve are. An organization might, for the sake of argument, say that, well, we need to migrate to cloud. We need to get everything on cloud. And because there's a lot of benefits to moving stuff on cloud, but unless you know why you're trying to do that, you're not going to make informed choices about how much stuff to take or what stuff to take, or whether you're just building new, and how much you're going to invest in it, and so on. And so it's that having a really succinct way of almost like what the elevator pitch is, or the drivers behind that's simple enough for people to be able to remember, is key because then it's much easier for people to make the day-to-day decisions that then align back to that thing. If it's too complicated, it's never going to feed into that daily conscious decision making. And I think it's I guess remember that this is particularly relevant to defence. Just because it's old doesn't mean it's rubbish. There's a sort of a real tendency with digital transformation to go, well, that's legacy. Legacy's bad. It's all got to be replaced. New is always good, and it's not that clear cut. When I worked in banking and insurance, we use mainframe technology that dated back probably to the 1970s, maybe even the 1960s, and it was still fit for purpose. We looked at the business case for replacing it, and at that time it just didn't stack up. So we just had to integrate the new technologies and sort of the web type front ends that we were then building to integrate with the back ends. I mean, I've left that company a long time ago. I don't know if that stuff's still around, but sort of it was at that time it was costlier to replace it than it was to keep it going. And so it's just because it's legacy, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a dirty word. it might be fine, particularly if the ongoing maintenance costs are quite low and it can still integrate with new stuff.
That's great. I think that's pretty much like answered all my questions. I know you've got like a lot of stuff published. Get my words out. Published on like online. Is there if people are looking for extra resources? Have you got anything like on YouTube or blogs, or like where some places to find some of your talks?
So on the BAE Systems web pages, we have collated a whole load of blogs around government insights, and there's some defence digital collection of stuff there as well. It's not all my work, and I can't take credit for it all. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting on there is we've been doing this initiative called Client Conversations, where we do almost exactly what you've done here and talk to some senior stakeholders around the government space. There's quite a few senior defence figures that we've spoken to on there, and sort of get some of their thoughts on these kind of things. So if people want to find out more about what it's like to work in defence, in the sort of the defence technology sector, that will give some insights into some of the thinking behind some of these kind of influential figures.
Yeah, no, that'd be awesome. Great, thanks, Ben. Thanks for your time today. That was really important.
Thank you. All right, bye.